Arundhati Roy's talk is part of a series of lectures which has been set up by the Anuradha Ghandy Memorial Trust. Anuradha Ghandy, just a small introduction, passed away tragically 3 years ago in April 2008 of cerebral malaria. She was like one of us. She taught at Nagpur University. She was a graduate of the Bombay University. An intense sociologist who studied the problems of tribals, the problems of gender and women's exploitation. And this road took her on a revolutionary path, and finally she did support the movement of the tribals in the jungles, was dubbed an Naxalite. She supported the Maoist movement, and as part of the struggles and part of her travails, she moved from Chhattisgarh to Bihar, gave up all her normal middle-class existence and dedicated her life to changing society. When she passed away tragically at a fairly young age, some old friends of her from the university, journalists like me, others, got together and founded this small trust which is dedicated to holding lectures like these outside, and as I said, all those who would like to make a donation for further such meetings are welcome to do so. Arundhati Roy.
Thank you, Father, and thank you, Bernard, and thank you all of you for being here. Seeing this audience, would love to speak to you directly without looking down at these papers. But I would have done that if I was going to say the things that I have said before at several meetings and several forums. If I was going to talk about what's going on in the forests of Chhattisgarh, if I was going to tell you about my experiences walking with the comrades and so on. But I'm actually not going to do that. I've written about that and spoken about that several times. And what I'm going to say today might not be a table-thumping speech, but might be a little long, it might be a little technical, but I'm so happy to see so many young people here, because I'm really not trying to give you an ideological lecture. I really want you to try and understand something very serious is going on, and something so serious that very few people are even able to talk about it, far less write about it, and if they do write about it, get it published because of what is going on. So it's only through meetings like this that we can spread the word, or at least understand what's going on. So it's a bit of a story, but it's a technical story. मुझे मालूम है कि बहुत सारे लोग हैं यहाँ जो अंग्रेज़ी नहीं समझते हैं, लेकिन इसका अनुवाद होगा हिंदी में, क्योंकि ये अंग्रेज़ी में लिखी गई है, और इसका जो सब्जेक्ट है पूंजीवाद के प्रेत, और आपके शहर में कहानी शुरू होती है एक प्रेतों का महल में, जिसमें हमारे देश के सबसे अमीर आदमी रहता है, जिसका नाम आप सबको मालूम है, मुकेश अंबानी. Is there any chance of switching off this light? Because I feel I'm being interrogated already. Thank you. Thank you. So, is it a house or a home? A temple to the new India, or a warehouse for its ghosts? Ever since Antilla arrived on Altamount Road in Mumbai, exuding mystery and quiet menace, things have not been quite the same. Here we are, the friend who took me there said, pay your respects to our new ruler. Antilla belongs to India's richest man, Mukesh Ambani. I'd read about this most expensive dwelling ever built, the 27 floors, the 3 helipads, the 9 lifts, the ballrooms, the weather rooms, the gymnasiums, the 6 floors of parking, and the 600 servants. But nothing had prepared me for the vertical lawn, a soaring 27-story high wall of grass attached to a vast metal grid. The grass was dry in patches and had fallen off in neat rectangles. Clearly, trickle down hadn't worked. But gush up certainly has. That's why in a nation of 1.2 billion people, India's 100 richest people own assets equivalent to 1/4 of the GDP. The small ramshackle building in the plot next to Antilla had a sign that said Bank of India. The word on the street and in the New York Times is that the Ambanis don't live in Antilla. No one knows for sure. People still whisper about ghosts and bad luck, Vastu and Feng Shui. But maybe it's actually all Karl Marx's fault, all that cussing. Capitalism, he said, and I quote, has conjured up such gigantic means of production and of exchange. It's like the sorcerer who is no longer able to control the powers of the netherworld, whom he has called up by his spells. In India, the 300 million of us who belong to the new post-reforms middle class, who are otherwise known as the market, live side by side with the spirits of the netherworld, the poltergeists of dead rivers, dry wells, bald mountains, denuded forests, the ghosts of 250,000 debt-ridden farmers who have killed themselves, and of the 800 million who have been impoverished and dispossessed to make way for us, and who live on less than 20 rupees a day. Mukesh Ambani is personally worth rupees 1,000 billion. That is 1 lakh crores. Who can understand how much that is? Put up your hand. Anyway, he holds a majority controlling share in Reliance Industries Limited, RIL, a company with a market capitalization of 2,100 billion. That's 2.1 lakh crores. And global business interests that include petrochemicals, oil, natural gas, polyester fiber, SEZs, fresh food retail, high schools, life science research, and stem cell storage services, and a whole lot more. RIL has a 95% stake in Infotel, which recently bought major shares in TV18, which in turn bought shares in ETV. So between them, they run about 27 news and entertainment channels in several languages. Infotel owns the only nationwide license for 4G broadband, a high-speed information pipeline, which, if the technology works, could be the future of information exchange. And Mr. Ambani also owns a cricket team. RIL is one of a handful of corporations that run India. Some of the others are the Tatas, Jindals, Vedanta, Mittals, Infosys, SR, and the other Reliance, ADAG, owned by Mukesh's brother Anil. Their race for growth has spilled across Europe, Central Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Their nets are cast wide. They are visible and invisible, overground as well as underground. The Tatas, for example, run more than 100 companies in 80 countries. They are one of India's oldest and largest private sector power companies. They own mines, steel plants, telephone, cable TV and broadband networks. They run whole townships. They manufacture cars and trucks. They own the Taj hotel chain, Jaguar, Land Rover, Daewoo, Tetley Tea, a publishing company, a chain of bookstores, a major brand of iodized salt, and the cosmetics giant Lakme. Since there are no laws restricting the cross-ownership of businesses in India, the gush up gospel rules. The more you have, the more you can have. The physics of capitalism inevitably means the increasing concentration of wealth. Conflict of interest is, of course, never a consideration. Until recently, corporates control the media by controlling advertising. So 90 to 95% of the turnover of media came from corporate advertising or from controlling and buying out journalists and editors. But now we have newspapers and TV channels whose holding companies have direct and major business interests. So other than ETV and TV18, which I spoke about, you have the Dainik Bhaskar, for example, and it's only one of many examples, which has 17.5 million readers in 4 languages across 13 states. But it also owns 69 companies with interests in mining, power generation, real estate, and textiles. A writ petition in the Chhattisgarh High Court accuses DB Power Limited, which is one of the companies, of using, I quote, deliberate, illegal and manipulative measures through company-owned newspapers to influence the outcome of a public hearing over an open-cast coal mine. But whether or not it has done that is not the point. The point is that it's in a position to do so. It has the power to do so. The laws of the land allow it to be in that position. In the race for profit, it's too much to expect that they're going to be good or moral or right about it. They are not misusing their position, they are using their position. This is what it's designed to be. So then we can't complain if the laws of the land allow it to be that. Scandal after scandal has exposed in painful detail how corporations with their mountain ranges of money and the mountains of minerals at their disposal buy or influence politicians, judges, bureaucrats, journalists, TV anchors, columnists. You've all heard the 2G tapes, and we don't have to, reinvent the wheel. We know that. Together they have succeeded in hollowing out democracy, retaining only its noisy rituals. Huge reserves of bauxite, iron ore, oil and natural gas worth trillions of dollars were sold to corporations for a pittance, defying even the twisted logic of the free market. They were just given to them and they pay the government royalties of between 0.2 and 5%. Cartels of corrupt politicians and corporations have colluded to underestimate the quantity of reserves and the actual market value of public assets, leading to the siphoning off of billions of dollars of public money. And then there's the land and water grab, the forced displacement of communities of millions of people whose lands are being appropriated by the state and handed over to private enterprise. Of course, the concept of the inviolability of private property never applies to the property of the poor. It only applies to the property of the rich. The scale of this appropriation is so huge, the vision behind it so dystopic, that it becomes hard to hold all of it in your imagination or to believe that it's really happening. It makes schemes like the Narmada Valley Development Project, over which people fought such a long and brave battle. It makes the Narmada Valley project look like some small cottage industry. Ignoring the huge debates questioning the benefits of dams, ignoring the fact that the massive Three Gorges Dam in China has been declared a failure, dam building in India continues at a breakneck speed. In Arunachal Pradesh alone, in that little state, they are building 168 big dams. All of them, almost all of them, being built by private companies, corporations. In Kashmir, the Gurez Dam will submerge a whole district. When people are shot dead for protesting against power cuts, which happened a few weeks ago in Kashmir, when there's an armed soldier for every 20 civilians, what chance do people have to stop a dam? After the explosion of the Fukushima nuclear plant, the whole world began to question and rethink about nuclear power. But in India, they are mushrooming around us, pardon the pun. We are being asked to believe that an administration that can't even manage normal industrial effluence, that can't even manage domestic garbage issues, is going to manage millions of tons of radioactive waste. Thanks to Operation Green Hunt and the fierce fighting in several states of central India, at least some of you must know of the hundreds of MOUs that the government has signed in Chhattisgarh, Orissa and West Bengal, handing over Adivasi homelands to private corporations. The privatization and corporatization of rivers, forests and mountains, which envisages a sort of social and economic re-engineering, which affects the lives of millions of people, continues to remain a secret. We have no idea what these MOUs are about, who they affect, what the profit and loss is, nothing. It's all secret. Since it has no colonies, India is colonizing itself along with parts of Africa. The raw materials extracted from this colony will either directly or through the revenues it generates feed the growth of the other India, urban India, which most of you are more familiar with. And yet, despite the hundreds of 24-hour television news channels, not many of us have heard about the other plans that are afoot, for which MOUs have been signed, money has been set aside, and land acquisition has begun. There have been no formal public announcements. None of these projects have been justified to us because they are all secret. But if we ask for the justification, of course the justification will be, oh, it's an income generating scheme for employment, for joblessness. But we all know that after 20 years of this phenomenal GDP growth, 60% of India's workforce is self-employed, 90% of the labor force is in the unorganized sector. And we know that major corporations like Tata are laying off workers in their thousands. But the government of Gujarat lights the path with the Dholera Special Investment Region, SIR, which is spread over 360 square kilometers. The government claims to have already raised investment worth $24 billion. The SIR is, of course, just another name for an SEZ, a self-governed corporate enclave of industrial parks, townships, and mega cities. This is the quote. If you want, you can look at the film on YouTube if you want to not sleep for a few nights. The Dholera SIR is going to be connected to Gujarat's other cities by a network of 10-lane highways. Now all these mega cities and business centers and high-speed flyovers and all of that are going to be built in the most water-stressed zone, one of the most water-stressed zones in the world. So, according to the Gujarat government's promotional video, it will come from the water will come from the Kalpasar Dam. The Kalpasar Dam has made a comeback after having been dismissed as a very bad idea for about 15 years. But it's suddenly resurfaced, and it's going to be a 35-kilometer long dam over the Gulf, the Bay of Kambat. And it's going to have a 10-lane highway on top of it. And the idea is to keep the seawater out and let the river water flow into the bay. But all the rivers have already been dammed. So where is that water going to come from? And the estimated cost of the dam is $11.7 billion. Of course, it'll destroy that whole coastline, it'll destroy the estuaries, it'll destroy the fish, it'll destroy those communities. But they don't really count, they're not really people. The Dholera SIR is only one of the mega industrial hubs that are going to be part of what is known as the DMIC, which is the Delhi-Mumbai Industrial Corridor, which is a 1,500 kilometer long industrial corridor that connects Delhi to Mumbai, 300 kilometers wide, with 9 such mega hubs. The project says that it'll have a 200 to 250 square kilometer high-speed freight line, 3 ports and 6 airports, a 6-line intersection-free expressway connecting the country's political and financial capitals, and a 4,000 megawatt power plant. 180 million people will be affected by this project. Affected how? They don't say. It envisages the building of several new cities and says that the population in the region will grow from 231 million to 314 million by the year 2020. So when P. Chidambaram said that he envisages an India in which 70% of the population will live in cities, which means the sort of forcible movement of something like 500 million people, he wasn't just talking of a utopia. Clearly there was a plan. This whole plan has been backed by McKinsey. And when was the last time we heard of a government or a dictatorship or a despotic state transferring populations on this scale? It cannot be done peacefully. It can only be done if India turns into a police or a military state. And as you already know, in central India that has already happened. In Chhattisgarh, Jharkhand, Orissa, under the name of Operation Green Hunt, they first deployed 200,000 paramilitary forces. Today, there's not much talk going on, right? Last year and year before last, this time, there was all the talk about the terrorists in the forests and so on, because they needed to justify Operation Green Hunt. They had already emptied 600 villages in Chhattisgarh, 3.5 lakh people on the run, people being forced to move into police camps, those who didn't come out were being called terrorists, the poorest people in this country, Adivasi people, were being called terrorists. Now there's quiet because they are preparing to call out the army. Already the brigade headquarters and Air Force bases are being readied. So until they are ready, everything is quiet. And then they are going to deploy the army. They've already tried these UAVs, these unmanned vehicle, aircrafts which are bombing in Pakistan, but those haven't worked in this forest area. But the army is being readied. Counter-terrorism training schools are springing up. So this is the new India, self-governing tax havens for corporations and war for the poor. As the army prepares to be deployed, it's gearing up to deal with what it calls perception management. It has a doctrine on military and psychological operations out, and I'm quoting from it. A planned process of conveying a message to a select target audience to produce and promote particular themes that result in desired attitude and behavior, which affect the achievement of political and military objectives of the country. So, this is army speak, but basically they are just preparing to use the media to brainwash us into accepting that it's a necessity that the army must be called out. Corporations have their own perception management strategies. And this is what I really want you to listen to very carefully. With a minuscule percentage of their profits, they run trusts, educational institutions, foundations, which in turn fund NGOs, academics, politicians, policymakers, journalists, artists, filmmakers, literary festivals, and even protest movements. They use charity, philanthropy they like to call it, to lure opinion makers into their sphere of influence. So it's not that they always do bad work, but the thing is that funds are available to these opinion makers to do a certain kind of work. So the funds are not available for other kinds of work. They dry up. So those who see through this and don't want this slowly get marginalized and really can't work. This is a way of infiltrating normality, of colonizing ordinariness, so that challenging them seems as absurd or as esoteric as challenging reality itself. And from here, it's a very quick and easy step to there is no alternative. When reality has been sufficiently infiltrated, then the logic gets inverted. The practice of charity, from being a part-time hobby subsidized by the sort of indecent surplus that they generate, becomes the justification for the system that creates the surplus in the first place. Nandan Nilekani, the CEO of Infosys, said quite disarmingly in an interview to Barbara Crossett, to have philanthropy, you need to create wealth. So corporate philanthropy is a bit like the commercial fishing industry. You know, the big fishing trawlers, they trawl the oceans in the deep seas with these huge nets, and they drag in tons of fish, not all of which they want, because Western consumers, they only eat select portions of select fish. But the nature of capitalism is such, and this, the such a frenzy, that they cut off the fins of the sharks before the sharks die, and then they throw the sort of finless sharks and the dead fish that they don't want back into the sea, and they take what the first world will eat. It's cruel, but that's business. That's what it does. Killing the sharks takes too much time. But now philanthropy has made its entry into the world of commercial fishing. So the EU fishery chief, Maria Damanaki, told people in Europe and the EU, as a part of sweeping marine reform, that instead of discarding these dead fish at sea, low-value fish should be distributed to charities. So not that we should change our way of doing things, we should stop emptying the oceans, but just give these cheap dead fish to poor people. Sweet. Perhaps she could call it the Fishy Foundation. And a few Somali pirates who are mostly fishermen who've taken to piracy because there are no fish left in the sea could be on the board. Trusts, foundations, and think tanks have a fascinating and secret history. The big ones, endowed by 19th century robber barons, 20th century fascists, and 21st century Silicon Valley barons like Rockefeller, Ford, Carnegie, and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and others have spawned things like the Council on Foreign Relations, Chatham House in the UK, the Trilateral Commission, and the Aspen Institute, all of which are very active in India now. And they provide the platform where the international platform where bankers, politicians, senior bureaucrats, corporate executives, industrialists, weapons manufacturers, academics, journalists, and NGO workers can do business. Which isn't a bad thing in itself, except that whoever provides the platform calls the tune. And the tune is, and always has been, the anthem of the free market. In the US, where the inspiration comes from, trusts and foundations are called not-for-profit organizations. But their kind of philanthropy is actually the most lucrative business of all. It is the groundwork on which the corporate business empire rests, because effectively it privatizes policy making itself. And in India, its potential for this massive dividend, this kind of supposedly missionary activity, the dividends had not been fully understood. So until recently, industrialists were just building temples and so on. But now they've understood it, though the Tatas understood it a long time ago. So other than their educational institutes like Tata Institute of Social Service and Tata Institute of Fundamental Research, they run two of the largest charitable trusts in India. They donated $50 million some years ago to that needy institution, the Harvard Business School. The Jindals, with a major stake in mining, metals and power, run the Jindal Global Law School and will soon open the Jindal School of Government and Public Policy. It's interesting, Naveen Jindal, the CEO of Jindal, he's an MP. He's also the director or chairman or whatever of the National Flag Foundation, because he won this case for the right to fly the flag on his house. And the Jindal's law school, recently it held a protest workshop. So they flew all these activists and poets and singers to kind of demonstrate how to protest to these rich kids in the business school. So, they just lay siege to us. Basically, they are on the opposition, they're on the business, they're everywhere. Financed by profits from the software giant Infosys, the New India Foundation gives prizes and fellowships to social scientists. The Observer Research Foundation, ORF, endowed by Mukesh Ambani, has retired intelligence agents, strategic analysts, senior politicians from both parties who pretend to fight in parliament but work together on these foundations, journalists, policymakers as its research fellows. So I'm just going to use the example of ORS to talk a little bit about how these foundations work. In its own words, I'm quoting now from the ORF's own publicity. The Observer Research Foundation was started in the early 90s during the troubled period of India's transition from a protected economy to a new engagement with the international economic order. The idea was to help develop a consensus in favor of economic reform. Since then, ORF scholars have made significant contributions towards improving government policies. ORF research projects have resulted in an immediate and tangible impact on economic and strategic policies of the country. The Foundation's activities can be neatly divided into two categories: projects and events. Both are an intrinsic part of the Foundation's objective in shaping, influencing public opinion and creating viable, alternative policy options in areas as divergent as employment generation in backward districts, and get this, real-time strategies to counter nuclear, biological and chemical threats. ORF's very first conference, organized in 1991, was inaugurated by the then Finance Minister, now Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, the apparatchik of the Washington Consensus and the architect of India's economic reforms. I was a little puzzled about this, this business house's preoccupation with nuclear and chemical warfare. But then, less so when in the long list of its institutional partners, I found the names of Raytheon and Lockheed Martin, two of the world's leading weapons manufacturers. What significant part did they play in improving the Indian government's policies? What exactly were the immediate and tangible impacts on India's strategic policies? In 2007, Raytheon announced it was turning its attention to India. Could it be that a good part of India's $80 billion defense budget for the next 10 years will be spent on weapons, guided missiles, aircraft, warships, and surveillance equipment manufactured by Raytheon and Lockheed Martin? The question here is, do we need weapons to fight wars, or do we need wars to create a market for weapons? Because the economies of the countries of Europe, US, and Israel depend very largely on the manufacture and sale of weapons. And it's the one thing that they haven't outsourced to China. It's the one thing that they still have to sell. When the US President Barack Obama, supposedly the most powerful man on earth, came to India in 2010, he came as little more than a salesman for Boeing. Now here's something to think about. In the new Cold War between US and China that's being played out in Africa and the Middle East, not many of us know that when Libya was bombed, basically 30,000 Chinese workers had to be evacuated because Gaddafi had, not only he said he wasn't going to trade in dollars, but he was signing big contracts with China. So in this new Cold War between the US and China, India's role is going to be what Pakistan's role was in the Cold War between the US and Russia. And many of the columnists and strategic analysts who are playing up these hostilities with China, you'll see, can be traced back directly or indirectly to the big Indo-American think tanks and foundations that I've just mentioned. And all of us know the history of what has happened to US allies in the past. Coming back to the Observer Research Foundation, you will also find the names in the institutional partners of RAND Corporation, Ford Foundation, the World Bank, the Ministry of Defense, the Brookings Institution, whose stated mission is, quote, to provide innovative and practical recommendations that advance three broad goals. One, strengthen American democracy. Two, foster the economic and social welfare, security, and opportunity of all Americans, and secure a more open, safe, and prosperous cooperative international system. You'll also find in that list the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation. Poor Rosa, who died for the cause of communism, to find her name on a list such as this one. They say that capitalism is about competition, but economic globalization has shown that it's capable of inclusiveness, promiscuity, and great solidarity. The great Western capitalists have done business with fascists, with socialists, with despots, and military dictators. It can adapt and it can constantly innovate. It's capable of quick thinking and immense tactical cunning. Over the last 20 years, the neoliberal establishment in India has worked out how to manage the government, the opposition, elections, the court, the media, and liberal opinion. What remains to be dealt with is growing unrest, the threat of people's power. How do you domesticate it? How do you turn protesters into pets? How do you vacuum up people's fury and direct it into blind alleys? The attempt internationally to manage and control the Arab Spring was one such experiment which didn't succeed. Initially, when the people rose up in Tahrir Square in Egypt, you recall the US government supported that uprising enthusiastically. The Western media, which picks and chooses its uprisings very carefully. I mean, if 5 million people are killed in the Congo, you don't hear about it. But suddenly, Egypt was the flavor of the month, and everything they did was being reported. But it was a bit puzzling because, if you read the newspapers 3 months before the uprising, there was a small news item which said that Hosni Mubarak was dying. He was terminally ill. So they knew that there was going to be an explosion at the time of the transfer of power. So how to co-opt that, how to control it. So there was this big sort of support of this uprising. And when Hosni Mubarak stepped down, you remember these ridiculous headlines: Egypt free, army takes over. And you're like supposed to celebrate, And then the people of Egypt realized what had happened. And now there was a second uprising. And this was an uprising against the army. And that time when it was crushed, it used US weapons. The unions, all these people were mobilizing, but eventually, of course, it can be co-opted by the Islamic right. But let's come to India's Tahrir Square, my favorite revolution. The largely middle-class, overtly nationalist, anti-corruption protest led by Anna Hazare and a clutch of NGO activists funded by Ford Foundation, Coca-Cola and the Lehman Brothers. That had a different trajectory. It actually capitalized on genuine popular rage against massive corporate scams like the 2G, the Commonwealth Games, the Bellari brothers, as well as the fury of ordinary people against the daily grind and the humiliation of corruption in dealing with public sector. But Anna Hazare's movement, though it called itself a Gandhian movement, its definition of corruption came from an accountant's imagination. How do you define corruption? The only way you can define corruption is if you nail that definition to an accepted legality. Whereas in India, a vast section of our population is outside the legality anyway. The slum dwellers, the rediwalas, the pavement dwellers. And this movement, though it capitalized on real anger, the law that it was advocating was highly un-Gandhian. It was a centralized, draconian agency with powers to prosecute, to investigate, and to punish. Around the clock, corporate-sponsored media campaign proclaimed it to be the voice of the people. Pope Arundhati, he told us it was the voice of the people. And like they were telling you, these TV channels who are so hostile to every people's movement in this country were now like travel agents for Anna Hazare. Gather here, go from here to there, this time so and so will come. It was crazy. Anyway, unlike the Occupy Wall Street movement in the US, this movement did not breathe a word against privatization, against corporate power, against economic reforms. It did not demand an end to the cross-ownership of businesses or laws that would dismantle the concentration of wealth and power. Its principal media backers successfully turned the spotlight away from massive corporate corruption scandals and used the public mauling of politicians to call for a further withdrawal of discretionary powers from the state, for more reforms, for more privatization. After 2 decades of these reforms of phenomenal but jobless GDP growth, India has more malnourished children than anywhere else in the world, and more poor people in 8 of its states than 26 countries of sub-Saharan Africa put together. Despite having been successful in powering through these reforms, despite having waged wars and militarily occupied countries in order to put into place free market democracies, capitalism is going through a crisis whose gravity has not revealed itself completely yet. Marx said, "What the bourgeoisie therefore produces above all are its own grave diggers. Its fall and the victory of the proletariat are equally inevitable." But unfortunately, the proletariat, as Marx saw it, is far from being anywhere close to victory. In fact, it has been dissolved, divided, dismantled, and has almost ceased to exist as a political force. The factories have been shut down, jobs have disappeared, trade unions have been disbanded. The mill workers who are present here in the audience can tell you about that. The proletariat, now called the precariat because of the precariousness of its means of livelihood, has over the years been pitted against each other in every possible way. Here in India, it's been Hindu against Muslim, Hindu against Christian, Dalit against Adivasi, caste against caste, region against region. While we break mosques and bomb buildings, while we argue about whether Adivasis actually constitute Marx's revolutionary proletariat or not, whether Maoism is actually an ism or not, whether Maoists are infantile or the parliamentary left are social fascists, while we expend all our passion and energy destroying each other, the big capitalists watch from their vantage points in the control room and smile. While we rip each other apart, they steal the world and put it in their pocket. Ironically, capitalism, which is supposed to be based on competition, we've seen has shown itself capable of great solidarity and great flexibility. And the left radical tradition, whose ideology is supposed to be based on solidarity, has historically shown itself to be rigid, doctrinaire, puritanical, and authoritarian. It has not been very successful in adapting itself to the very special social conditions that prevail in India. The acrimonious splintering, the endless wrangling, and it has to be said, brilliant intellectual sparring between left intellectuals and their political parties is not a subject that lends itself to passing mention in a talk like this. I've dealt with some of it in my earlier writing, so I'm not going to repeat myself here. But let me say that whatever criticism I have is offered in the spirit of solidarity. One of the reasons that I am more than pleased to be doing the Anuradha Ghandy Memorial Lecture is that she, perhaps more than most people in the broad spectrum of what we call the left in India, not just pointed out, but spent much of her life working on trying to correct two of its greatest lacunae: its failure to address the politics of caste and the politics of gender. She understood that caste lies at the very heart of Indian politics. The rift between the Dalit community and the left began with the falling out between Dr. Ambedkar and S.A. Dange, trade unionist and founding member of the Communist Party of India. Dr. Ambedkar's disillusionment with the Communist Party began with the textile workers' strike in the late 1920s here in Mumbai. He grew disillusioned when he realized that despite the rhetoric of working class solidarity, the party didn't find it objectionable that untouchables were kept out of the weaving department and only qualified for the lower paid jobs in the spinning department. Because in the weaving department they had to keep the thread in their mouths and the saliva of the Dalit was polluting. So communist solidarity somehow evaporated there. In the Annihilation of Caste, published in 1936, Ambedkar said, the caste system is not merely a division of labor, it's a division of laborers. He realized that in a society where the Hindu scriptures institutionalize untouchability and inequality, the battle for untouchables, for social and civic rights, was too urgent to wait for the promised communist revolution. It could not be subsumed under the Marxist adage of class is caste. In 1937, addressing a conference for depressed class railway workers, Ambedkar said, and I'm quoting, "There are, in my view, two enemies which the workers of this country have to deal with. The two enemies are Brahmanism and capitalism. The accusation by our critics arises partly because the critics, and by critics he was talking about the Communist Party then. The critics arises partly because critics fail to reckon Brahmanism as an enemy which the workers have to deal with. I do not want to be misunderstood when I say that Brahmanism is an enemy which must be dealt with. By Brahmanism, I do not mean the power, privileges and interests of the Brahmins as a community. That is not the sense in which I am using the word. By Brahmanism, I mean the negation of the spirit of liberty, equality and fraternity. In that sense, it is rampant in all classes and is not confined to the Brahmins alone, though they have been the originators of it. The Brahmanism which pervades everywhere and which regulates the thoughts and deeds of all classes is an incontrovertible fact. It is also an incontrovertible fact that this Brahmanism gives certain classes a privileged position. It denies other classes even equality of opportunity. The effects of Brahmanism are not confined to social rights such as interdining or intermarriage. If that was so, one would not mind it. But it is not so. It extends to civic rights as distinguished from social rights. The use of schools, wells, public conveyance, restaurants are a matter of civic right. Everything which is intended for the public or maintained out of public funds must be open to every citizen. Then he went on to say, labor leaders who are accusing us are undoubtedly suffering from certain delusions. They have read in Karl Marx that there can be only two classes, owners and workers. And on reading Marx, they straightaway assume that in India there are only owners and workers and proceed on their mission of demolishing capitalism. But the rift between the Ambedkarites and the left has come at a great cost to both. It is meant that a great majority of the Dalit population has pinned its hopes for deliverance and dignity to constitutionalism, to capitalism, and to political parties like the BSP, which practice an important but in the long run stagnant brand of identity politics. Last month, the Dalit Indian Chamber of Commerce and Industry was inaugurated. Dalit Incorporated, ready to show business can beat caste, the Indian Express reported, and went on to quote a mentor of the DICCI. I'm quoting, getting the Prime Minister for a Dalit gathering is not difficult in our society, but for Dalit entrepreneurs, taking a photograph with Tata and Godrej over lunch and tea is an aspiration and proof that they have arrived, he said. Given the current situation in modern India, it would be casteist and downright reactionary to say that Dalit entrepreneurs should not have a place at the high table. But if that is the ideological framework of Dalit politics, it's a great pity. Because the Dalit community could end up like post-apartheid South Africa, where a few black millionaires in their Mercedes rule the country, and the majority of the black population is worse off than it was during apartheid. So in India, to view society solely through the lens of caste and identity without a class analysis is as misleading as the casteist class school of thought. To take both into account is hellishly difficult, to theorize as well as to put into practice. But unless it's done, the mainstream space will continuously be ceded to the politics of identity and the politics of Hindu chauvinism. It could be one of the reasons that explains why the Naxalite movement has largely been confined to Adivasi areas. It's true that in Bihar and North Andhra Pradesh there were years when the NCC, PW and other Naxalite groups did succeed in opposing the Ranveer Sena and in succeeding in seizing land from zamindars and redistributing it. But eventually they lost their Dalit constituency to the more mainstream brand of identity politics. This is partly due to the fact that militarism is a central tenet of the Maoist party, and rightly so, but villages in the plains do not provide cover for guerrilla warfare. But the consolidation of Maoist politics in Adivasi areas could also be because Adivasi society does not present communists with the doctrinal problems that caste Hindu society does. Ironically, Dr. Ambedkar, so sharp about the politics of untouchables, often dismissed Adivasis as savages. A few months ago, I spent some time with a friend, a Dalit friend and a comrade, a former member of PW. He continues to be a supporter and a sympathizer of the CPI Maoist, but has an important and constructive critique of its shortcomings on the caste issue. While he spoke to me at length, his wife was buzzing around him, continuing with her very conventional wifely duties. So I suggested to him that it wasn't just caste, and it wasn't just the CPI Maoists, but maybe everybody, including individuals, should also look at the woman question. So he looked at me and bluntly said, I don't know about that, I'm not a woman. So everybody sort of has this inability to look at justice somehow as a foundational thing. But Anuradha Gandhi, she knew plenty about that. In the recently published book of her selected writings, she writes at length about why she became a Marxist-Leninist and not a liberal activist or a radical feminist or an eco-feminist or an Ambedkarite. But this didn't blind her to the serious problems that women comrades faced within the revolutionary movement. At the time she died, that's what she was working on: how to purge the Maoist party of its continuing discrimination against women by men who think of themselves as revolutionary. Anu Gandhi was instrumental in setting up one of the most formidable feminist organizations in our country today, the Krantikari Adivasi Mahila Sangathan, with 90,000 members whom I met in the forests. All 90,000 of them, of course, are Maoists and therefore terrorists and therefore liable to be shot at sight. But the failure to see that the equality of women has to be an absolute and non-negotiable part of the revolutionary process and not just a post-revolution promise alienated many progressive women and pushed them in great numbers towards liberal activism. The liberal feminist movement and the Dalit movement have become heavily NGOized. Many of these NGOs have done very good work on gender, on sex work, on homosexuality, on health, on AIDS, and all of this. But as long as their work doesn't actually challenge the economic structures of the neoliberal empire, the money will keep coming. So you see that people who are official feminists, the official feminist groups will always keep their distance from radical feminist issues like displacement, where women suffer the most. Why are they not there with the Narmada protests or with the protests in Chhattisgarh? Because NGO funding doesn't allow that to be part of the agenda. Now, at a time when capitalism is going through such a serious crisis, it's important for the left to show a new and more flexible and inclusive imagination. I returned from my trip to the Dandakaranya forest with a great deal of admiration for the struggle the CPI Maoist is waging there against the greatest odds. Across Chhattisgarh, Orissa, Jharkhand and West Bengal, the Maoist party, along with a host of other militant mass movements, despite all their arguments and setbacks, have stopped some of the richest corporations in their tracks. But it's a fragile and temporary victory. They're under siege There's no help coming their way, and we must not lose sight of the fact that it's just a holding operation against a marauding force that has pushed us all against the wall. If you look at what has happened in the last 30 years, when the Naxalbari movement started in the late 60s, what were they asking for? People were asking for justice. People were asking for land redistribution, for the taking away of land from zamindars, the distributing land to the tiller and so on. The Naxalite movement was crushed, then the JP movement started, but even then people were asking for equality. The emergency came, it was to crush what Indira Gandhi thought of as Sampurna Kranti, a complete revolution. But today what has happened, we are fighting to prevent land, what little land people have, from being taken away. We've forgotten the idea of justice. It's been reduced to human rights. In Jungle Mahal, the whole thing started because they're asking the police to apologize for killing people. Even that was not forthcoming. So we've been actually pushed against a wall, and even the radical revolutionary movements are now fighting to save the takeover of people's lands. The landless, the slum dwellers, the people who are marginal in other ways, who don't have land, are not even part of the revolutionary vocabulary anymore. So we really have suffered a very, very big setback, which we have to face up to and acknowledge. But despite all of this, capitalism is in a crisis. Trickle down failed, gush up is failing too. The international financial meltdown is closing in. The growth rate has plummeted to 6.9%. Foreign investment is pulling out, and these huge international corporations, including Reliance, are sitting on huge cash reserves. They don't know where to invest, and that is a structural crack in capitalism. It's more terrifying than anything else. If you have money and you can't push it out and you can't make it grow. Capitalism's real grave diggers may end up being its own delusional cardinals who have turned ideology into faith. They seem to have difficulty comprehending reality or grasping the science of climate change, which says quite simply that capitalism, including the Chinese variety, is destroying the planet. Derek Jensen, author of Endgame, offers us some grim statistics. 90% of the large fish in the ocean are gone. There's 10 times as much plastic as there is phytoplankton. 97% of the Earth's native forests are destroyed. 98% of native grasslands are destroyed. Amphibian populations are collapsing. 200 species of living organisms are driven to extinction every day. The two old tricks that dug capitalism out of crises in the past, war and shopping, militarism and consumption, are not going to work anymore. So now, what are we going to do? It might be too much to ask people in the cities to support the struggle in the forest. That's a separate matter, that we must fight for the people in those forests to be allowed to remain in the forest. We must fight for a non-capitalist society to survive in that forest, because they are not the past, they are the future. But if you want me to just tell you one tangible thing that we must ask for, whether you're from the right, whether you're from the left, whether you're a farmer, whether you're a businessman, whether you're a student or a poet or whoever you are, one thing is that these giant monopolies must be dismantled. We must stop the cross-ownership of businesses. Otherwise, even small businesses will end up like small farmers, like squatters outside the giant, mega capitalists, sort of selling them ancillary products or something. So that has to stop. I stood outside Antilla for a long time, watching the sun go down. Why did the Ambanis call it Antilla? Antilla is the name of a set of mythical islands whose story dates back to the 8th century Iberian legend, when the Muslims conquered Hispania. 6 Visigothic bishops put their parishioners into 6 ships and set sail. They fled the coast of Spain. And after some weeks at sea, they arrived on this set of islands called Antilla, where they decided to raise a new civilization. And they burnt their boats to permanently sever their links to their barbarian-dominated homeland. The Ambani's Antillas bought at a subsidized rate from the Karimboy Ibrahim Khoja Orphanage Trust. By calling their tower Antilla, did they hope to sever their links to the poverty and squalor of their homeland and raise a new civilization closer to the sky? Is this the final act of the most successful secessionist movement in India, the secession of the middle and upper classes into outer space? As night fell over Mumbai, guards in crisp linen shirts with crackling walkie-talkies appeared outside the forbidding gates of Antilla. The lights blazed on to frighten the ghosts, perhaps. People in the neighborhood complained that Antilla has stolen the night. Perhaps it's time for us to take back the night. Thank you.
Thank you for a